Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Tuesday, April 28th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today will reach 70.6 degrees, while the low will drop to 48.7 degrees, making for a pleasant spring day for the area. In our top stories, we are digging into the details surrounding the man currently charged with attempting to assassinate Donald Trump. We will also take a close look at the legal complexities of why the Supreme Court might shield Bayer from thousands of pending cancer lawsuits. Beyond these major reports, we have several other significant stories from around the globe to discuss. All this and more is coming up on Alex's News, so be sure to stay tuned. We begin this morning with a story that has shaken the nation's capital. Federal authorities have now formally charged a man with the attempted assassination of President Donald Trump. The shooting happened over the weekend at a high-profile press event. Ethan, what do we know so far?
Grace, the U.S. Department of Justice announced today that 31-year-old Cole Tomas Allen has been charged in connection with a shooting at the Washington Hilton. According to the DOJ and the BBC, it happened Saturday evening, April 25th, during the White House Correspondents' Association dinner. That's just 3 days ago. President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and several cabinet members were all inside at the time.
So the president was in the building when this happened. Walk us through what actually took place that night.
According to the FBI affidavit and reporting from Al Jazeera, it was approximately 8:40 p.m. when Allen tried to bypass a security checkpoint on the hotel's terrace level, one floor above the main ballroom. He was armed with a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, a Rock Island Armory 1911 .38 caliber semi-automatic pistol, and 3 knives. He allegedly rushed straight through a magnetometer in the lobby area. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act, as we'll get into shortly.
That's a staggering amount of weaponry. Was anyone hurt during the confrontation?
Allen fired his shotgun at least once during the breach. A U.S. Secret Service officer, identified in court documents only as Officer VG, was struck in the chest. Thankfully, that officer survived without serious injury because he was wearing a ballistic vest. Secret Service personnel returned fire immediately, discharging approximately 5 rounds. Allen wasn't actually hit by any of those bullets, but he fell to the ground, sustained minor injuries, and was tackled and taken into custody.
And what was happening inside the ballroom while all of this unfolded?
It was chaos, as you'd expect. CBS News and the Washington Post described guests diving under tables the moment they heard gunfire. Secret Service agents swarmed the president and vice president and rushed them both off the stage to safety. The dinner was immediately canceled, and the entire hotel was evacuated. This is supposed to be one of Washington's most glamorous nights, and it turned into a security nightmare.
Let's talk about the suspect. Who is Cole Tomas Allen?
He's a resident of Torrance, California, and by all outward appearances, he doesn't fit a typical profile. Al Jazeera and the BBC reported that Allen holds a master's degree in computer science from the California Institute of Technology, better known as Caltech. Professionally, he worked as a computer engineer and also as a part-time high school tutor for a test preparation service. He had no prior criminal record whatsoever, which is part of what makes this case so unsettling for investigators.
So no red flags in his background. Did he leave any kind of digital footprint that hinted at what was coming?
He did, and it's significant. Investigators uncovered activity under the online moniker Cold Force, where Allen allegedly shared anti-administration rhetoric. According to the Los Angeles Times, he was associated with progressive activist circles, including a modern network of artists and activists called the Wide Awakes, and a group called the No Kings Protest Movement. That movement opposed what they characterized as the president's authoritarian policies. Federal records also show Allen donated $25 to a Democratic Political Action Committee supporting Kamala Harris through Act Blue back in 2024.
You mentioned this wasn't spur of the moment. What evidence of planning has surfaced?
The FBI's Washington field office has laid out a pretty detailed timeline. According to the DOJ, Allen reserved a room at the Washington Hilton on April 6th, nearly 3 weeks before the attack. To avoid air travel security, He traveled from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. by train, stopping in Chicago along the way. He arrived in the capital on April 24th, the day before the shooting. Every step of this trip appears calculated to avoid detection.
And then there's this manifesto. What exactly did he write?
Minutes before the shooting, Allen sent a 1,052-word scheduled email to his family and a former employer. It was titled Apology and Explanation. As reported by the New York Post and PBS, he signed the message, quote, Cold Force-friendly federal assassin Allen, end quote. In it, he described the Trump administration as complicit in various crimes and referred to the president as a traitor. He framed what he was about to do as a reluctant necessity for a U.S. citizen.
That's chilling language. I understand there was also a specific target list in that document?
There was, and it's one of the most scrutinized parts of the whole manifesto. Allen laid out what he called rules of engagement. He explicitly stated that Trump administration officials were his primary targets, prioritized from highest ranking to lowest. That placed President Trump at the very top, followed by the vice president and then the cabinet. It reads like someone who spent a long time thinking through this in an almost clinical way.
And there's one very strange detail about that list involving FBI Director Kash Patel. What's going on there?
This is the part that really has investigators puzzled. As highlighted by the Sunday Guardian and Axios, Allen included a parenthetical exclusion. He wrote, quote, administration officials not including Mr. Patel, they are targets, end quote. So he deliberately carved out FBI Director Kash Patel. Patel hasn't issued a public statement about it. Investigators have floated two theories so far. The first involves what they're calling religious hostility. Allen's writings were heavily anti-Christian, and since Patel is Hindu, he may not have fit Allen's so-called Christian oppressor profile.
And the second theory?
According to Politico, the second theory is that Allen may have viewed Patel as an outsider within the administration because of rumors that Patel was facing imminent removal. Either way, it didn't spare Patel from danger. He was present at the Hilton that night and had to be safely evacuated alongside other officials. It's a bizarre wrinkle in an already deeply disturbing case.
Where do things stand legally? Allen appeared in court yesterday, right?
That's correct. On Monday, April 27th, Allen appeared in U.S. District Court wearing blue prisoner fatigues. He was described as calm and spoke softly to the judge, but he has not yet entered a plea. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche and U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro announced 3 primary federal counts. Those are attempted assassination of the President of the United States, transportation of a firearm and ammunition in interstate commerce with intent to commit a felony, and discharge of a firearm during a crime of violence.
What kind of sentence is he looking at if convicted?
He faces a mandatory minimum of 10 years and a maximum sentence of life in prison. He's being held without bond right now. His detention hearing is scheduled for Thursday, April 30th, so just 2 days from now. Given the severity of these charges, legal analysts don't expect him to be released before trial.
This is now the 3rd time someone has tried to assassinate President Trump. Can you put that in context for us?
It's a staggering pattern. Live Now from Fox noted the 2 prior incidents. On July 13th, 2024, Thomas Matthew Crooks fired shots at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, grazing President Trump's ear. Then on September 15th, 2024, Ryan Wesley Routh was apprehended with a rifle at the Trump International Golf Club in West Palm Beach. Routh was sentenced to life in prison just this past February. 3 attempts in roughly 2 years is virtually unprecedented in modern American history.
How is the White House responding to all of this?
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt characterized the dinner as being, quote, hijacked by a crazed anti-Trump individual, end quote. She went further, blaming what she called deranged lies from political rivals for inspiring the violence. The tone from the administration has been both defiant and accusatory. They're clearly framing this in political terms heading into a charged environment.
And what about the security failures? How did an armed man get that far into the building?
That's the question everyone is asking. While the White House maintained that law enforcement successfully neutralized the threat, critics want to know how an armed individual reached the terrace level of the Hilton without even showing ID. White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles is expected to meet this week to discuss updated security protocols, specifically for high-profile black tie events held at public venues. This breach is going to reshape how these gatherings are protected going forward.
A deeply unsettling story all around. Ethan, thank you for walking us through all of that.
Of course, Grace.
We turn now to a legal battle that could reshape corporate liability in this country for decades. The United States Supreme Court heard oral arguments yesterday in Monsanto Company versus Durnell, a case that pits federal regulation against the rights of individuals to sue over a popular weed killer. Chloe has been following this one closely. Chloe, just how big is this case?
It's enormous, Grace. This case, also known as Bayer versus Durnell, asks whether federal law shields the agrochemical giant Bayer from thousands of state-level lawsuits alleging its weed killer Roundup causes cancer. USA Today, NPR, and U.S. News and World Report all describe a court that appears deeply divided after yesterday's arguments. A ruling one way could wipe out tens of thousands of pending claims, and a ruling the other way could expose Bayer to potentially hundreds of billions in future damages.
So who is John Durnell, the man at the center of all this?
He's a St. Louis man who was known around his neighborhood as the, quote, spray guy, end quote, because he used Roundup for over 20 years. After all that exposure, he developed non-Hodgkin lymphoma. In 2023, a Missouri jury awarded him $1.25 million in damages. According to USA Today, Bayer is now using Durnell's case specifically to seek a definitive Supreme Court ruling that would effectively extinguish all similar claims nationwide.
And yesterday's oral arguments showed just how split the justices are on this?
They really did. NPR reports the central legal question is something called federal preemption. Essentially, does a federal law known as the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, override the ability of individuals to sue under state consumer protection laws for failure to warn? The justices showed a rare lack of consensus, with different members of the court landing on completely opposite sides of that question.
What was Bayer's argument for why federal law should win out?
Bayer's attorney, Paul Clement, along with Justice Brett Kavanaugh, pushed the idea of federal uniformity. Their argument is that the Environmental Protection Agency regulates pesticide labels and doesn't currently require a cancer warning for Roundup. So Bayer contends that allowing individual states to penalize them for not having that warning creates what they called a chaotic, quote, patchwork of standards, end quote. In their view, the EPA's decision not to require a label should be the final word.
And the other side sees it very differently?
Completely differently. Chief Justice John Roberts appeared sympathetic to the plaintiffs, whose attorney Ashley Keller argued that state lawsuits are actually more responsive to emerging safety data than federal bureaucracies. USA Today notes that Keller specifically argued the EPA is not a, quote, safe harbor, end quote. He said critical safety concerns frequently, quote, slip through the cracks, end quote, of federal oversight, which is exactly why states need to retain the power to hold companies accountable on their own.
Now, there's another dimension here that I think caught a lot of people off guard. The Trump administration got involved in a pretty unusual way.
That's right, and it fundamentally altered the legal landscape. On February 18, 2026, President Trump issued Executive Order 14387. The Guardian and Claims Journal both detail how this order reclassified glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, and its precursor elemental phosphorus, as materials, quote, critical to the national defense, end quote. That reclassification was done under the Defense Production Act of 1950, and it opened the door to an entirely new argument before the court.
So the government is now calling this a national security issue?
Exactly. The administration's Solicitor General argued before the justices that state-level verdicts aren't just legal disputes anymore. They're, quote, national security risks, end quote. that could bankrupt what the administration describes as the nation's only domestic producer of these chemicals. It's a dramatic escalation, Grace. We went from a product liability case to a national defense argument in a matter of weeks.
Has the Defense Production Act ever been used like this before?
Not successfully. Medical Daily points out that historically, Section 707 of the Defense Production Act has been used to protect companies from breach of contract claims when they're prioritizing government orders. It's never been used as a blanket shield against consumer health torts. Previous attempts to invoke the DPA for immunity, such as in the Agent Orange litigation or the 2020 COVID-19 meatpacking cases, were largely rejected by federal courts. So this would be genuinely unprecedented if the court accepts the argument.
And while the court is weighing all of this, Congress isn't sitting still either?
Not at all. There's a parallel fight happening on Capitol Hill right now. The 2026 Farm Bill, which is H.R. 7567, contains a controversial provision that critics have dubbed the Bayer Clause. It's Section 10205, and it seeks to codify federal preemption by establishing the EPA as the, quote, sole authority, end quote, for safety findings. If it passes, it would prevent states from requiring any additional warnings beyond what the EPA mandates.
I'd imagine that provision isn't going unchallenged.
It's not. In a bipartisan response, Representative Thomas Massey, a Republican from Kentucky, and Representative Chellie Pingree, a Democrat from Maine, introduced H.R. 7601, called the No Immunity for Glyphosate Act. That bill is currently in committee. It aims to nullify the legal immunity granted by the President's executive order and clarify that the Defense Production Act cannot be used to block state-level personal injury claims.
Let's talk about the science for a moment. Is there actually consensus on whether Roundup causes cancer?
There isn't, and that's part of what makes this so contentious. The World Health Organization labeled glyphosate, quote, probably carcinogenic to humans, end quote, back in 2015. But the EPA maintained in 2019 and continues to hold under the current administration that the chemical is safe. Here's where it gets complicated, though. USA Today points out that a 2022 federal court ruling found the EPA had not adequately considered cancer risks, which left the chemical's regulatory status in flux.
So even the federal agency Bayer is relying on for its defense has had its own findings questioned?
That's exactly right. It undermines the uniformity argument somewhat when the federal regulator's own conclusions have been challenged in court, and that's precisely the kind of crack the plaintiffs are pointing to when they say federal oversight alone isn't enough to protect public health.
This has also created some unusual political dynamics, hasn't it?
It really has. There's what's being described as a rift within the administration's own coalition. The White House supports Bayer under a food security framework, but the Make America Healthy Again movement, known as MAHA, is pushing back hard. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has expressed deep frustration with the administration's position. Protesters at a rally outside the court called the People versus Poison Rally argued that federal approval should be a, quote, floor, end quote, for safety, not a, quote, ceiling, end quote, for corporate accountability.
What are the financial stakes if the court rules against Bayer?
They're staggering. Bayer is already navigating a proposed $7.25 billion class action settlement, but U.S. News and World Report notes that nearly $1 billion in claims remain outside that deal. If the court rules against them, the company faces potentially hundreds of billions more in future damages. On the flip side, agricultural groups like the American Farm Bureau Federation have warned that if Bayer loses, the company may stop selling glyphosate to American farmers entirely, which they call a devastating risk to the nation's food supply.
So when should we expect a decision?
The Supreme Court is expected to issue its ruling by July of 2026. However this goes, legal experts on both sides agree it will serve as a landmark determination on the boundaries between federal regulatory power and the rights of states to protect their citizens. It could redefine corporate liability in the United States for decades to come, Grace.
A case with enormous implications, no matter which way it falls. Chloe, thanks for walking us through all of that.
Thanks, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. Asian stock markets are feeling a bit bearish this Tuesday as the Nikkei 225 slipped 1.1% to 59,884. Investors are finding the situation quite crude as international benchmark Brent oil prices surged toward $110 per barrel. The Bank of Japan kept interest rates at 0.75%, while warning that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is fueling energy costs and slowing growth to a crawl. With diplomatic efforts to end the conflict in Iran hitting a dead end during ceasefire negotiations in Pakistan, many fear the global economy is stuck in a stagflation station. Secretary of State Marco Rubio noted that talks remain stalled over demands to end the United States naval blockade before addressing nuclear concerns, leaving roughly 20% of the world's oil supply in a slippery situation. In a move that is quite taxing on international relations, the administration is moving to implement a more durable framework of import taxes after the Supreme Court ruled the Universal Liberation Day tariffs were out of order. Ambassador Jamieson Greer is leading public hearings today to investigate the trade practices of 60 economies regarding forced labor, aiming to find a more legal way to do one's duty. While the government uses a 10% global stopgap under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, that authority will expire on July 24, 2026. This legal pivot follows the ruling in Learning Resources, Incorporated versus Trump, which could force the government to cough up a refund between $160 billion and $200 billion in invalidated collections. Our trading partners in Canada and the United Kingdom are already finding these secondary demands a bit hard to trade. Moving to the Middle East, the ceasefire in Lebanon is looking rather fragile as hostilities reach a breaking point. The Israeli military has ordered an immediate exodus for residents of 16 southern towns, telling them to head toward the Sidon area. While President Joseph Aoun has committed to the truce, Hezbollah is refusing to play ball, leading to nearly 300 firing incidents reported by United Nations peacekeepers on April 27. With homes being demolished to create a yellow line buffer zone, that 3-week extension is looking like a short-lived olive branch. In a Newark courtroom, the sun is finally setting on Purdue Pharma. Judge Madeline Cox Arleo is expected to deliver a sentence today that will see the company forfeit $225 million and eventually dissolve into a new entity called Knoa Pharma. This settlement, totaling $7.4 billion, aims to provide a dose of relief for the opioid crisis. Members of the Sackler family are also on the hook for up to $7 billion over 15 years, proving that some legal headaches are a bitter pill to swallow. Finally, Nebraska is getting to work as the first state to implement Medicaid requirements under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Starting this Friday, May 1, 2026, roughly 72,000 able-bodied adults aged 19 to 64 must log 80 hours of work or community service to stay covered. Governor Jim Pillen and Dr. Mehmet Oz are pushing for self-sufficiency, but critics worry the rushed timeline could leave between 16,000 and 30,000 people out in the cold without a safety net. It is a Husker-sized hurdle for many residents trying to navigate the new system. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Opus 4.6, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.